Well, good morning again. It may come as somewhat of a surprise to you, but I was taught at an early age to be, there's a word for it, it's called ornery. Have you ever heard that word? I don't know how you spell it. I didn't even write it in my notes this morning. But I was taught at an early age to be just enough funny to get away with it, but not get in trouble for it. Anybody else raised that way? It was an early age that I was taught to be silly, to be goofy, to try to be a little bit humorous in order to make friends, because my parents knew I couldn't make friends any other way. I was taught, for the most part, to be just enough of a goofball or class clown to get away with it and not get in too much trouble for it. If you've gotten to know my dad in the past year, you know that I get it honest, as they say. And if you follow me or Pastor Angel at all on social media, there's a chance you saw some of my attempt at being funny show up on Facebook this week in this video. Watch this. She has no idea I'm in her office. It's second service. Can we watch it one more time? Please? Can you turn it up louder? Yeah, you can definitely hear it in that second round. I have to apologize for the wheezing in the back. I had no idea that I had emphysema. There's something that happens in some of the times. Sometimes I get to scare Pastor Angel, and sometimes it's like, yeah, but there are other times when her reaction scares me, and I get choked up a little bit and wheezed a little bit there in that episode. Forgive the wheezing. Believe it or not, I didn't wake up that morning planning to scare her. I walked into her office to tell her something, and she wasn't there, and I knew I've got about 15 seconds to hide here in the corner and use what I think is an attempt at being funny. But let's be honest. Any chance that I have to share a video of me scaring Pastor Angel with you on a Sunday morning, I'm going to do it. Back to growing up. I was taught, I learned, honest. To be just enough funny to get away with it, just enough funny to make some friends along the way, just enough ornery, just enough, yes, albeit annoying, to get laughs. But there were 2 or 3 occasions, just as any superhero learns his limits of his power, this young man learned, sometimes in negative ways, when he crossed the line. Did you ever hear that phrase growing up? You've crossed the line. Did you ever find yourself in a situation where you knew you crossed the line? In my growing up, in my experiencing, finding where those limits were, there was a phrase that my mom, my Pennsylvania Dutch mom, used on occasion with me that I knew I had crossed a line. And often this phrase was followed by another phrase, and that phrase was, "You just wait until your father gets home." But the phrase Mom would use before that, the exasperated phrase, when she'd had enough of the at-home clown Stevan, Mom would say, "Enough is enough." Did anybody else have a mom who had to say that in your growing up? Enough is enough. When I heard the phrase, when I knew the limit had been reached, I retreated as quickly as possible. Enough is enough is a phrase that can be used in a lot of different contexts, a lot of different ways. Those 3 words can be emphasized in and of themselves in different ways to mean different things. We can emphasize the first enough, as I heard my mom do often. Enough is enough. Enough is enough. Or enough is enough. Isn't English funny? with that phrase. It's with that phrase this morning that I want us to enter again into a conversation about the impact that God's grace has upon us. His enough is enough. Look with me at the mirror that is part of our ancestry as we look back at those silly little Israelites, right? In Exodus chapter 16. Let me set up this passage for us this morning. You can follow along on the screen or in the Bible app this morning. The Israelites, as you remember, our ancestors, our heritage this morning, where we trace back our beginnings in the Old Testament to here in Exodus 16. These Israelites, these chosen people of God, have been freed from slavery in Egypt, freed from bondage, free from this foreign oppression where they were enslaved as laborers, freed from this. They had called out to God for freedom, and He heard their prayer, and now they are following God's chosen leaders, Moses and Aaron. These brothers who are leading them out of bondage from Egypt, they've experienced the miraculous, right? The parting of the Red Sea. They've experienced God's presence in a palpable way. They know they are being led by God, and here they are, only a month out, complaining. Annoyingly, if we're honest, complaining about their lack of food, complaining about their growling stomachs, as we'll see in a second, complaining about their lack of road trip snacks. Look at Exodus 16, starting with verse 1 with me. The whole community of Israel set out from Elim and journeyed into the wilderness of Sin, between Elim and Mount Sinai. They arrived there on the 15th day of the second month, 1 month after leaving the land of Egypt. There too, the whole community of Israel complained about Moses and Aaron. Here's their complaint. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you, Moses and Aaron, have brought us into this wilderness to starve us all to death. Do you hear the complaining? These same Israelites, again, who called out to God for freedom from the difficulty of bondage and slavery back in Egypt. These Israelites, now a month out, complaining about how they didn't mind it as much as they remembered. Maybe there's a phrase amongst the camp, at least we had steak. At least steak was prepared the way we wanted it back in Egypt. When I invite us to look at this mirror of this passage this morning, I mean it. We know this universal tendency, our human bent to doubt and grumble when something is going differently than we had planned. When something is uncertain, our bent, our go-to, part of our sinful human DNA forces us back to this same attitude. This attitude of grumbling about this reality of us saying, things weren't so bad the way they once were. Anybody else resistant to change in February of 2024? Anybody else find themselves grumbling about the way things used to be when we didn't have to worry so much about the good old days? Sure, I'm a lot like these grumbling Israelites, longing for the good old days where things seemed easier, saying things like, at least back in Egypt, I didn't have to worry about all of the provisions. I read this recently, that one of the great dangers of complaining is that it blinds us to reality. The author states, faith is grateful for what is and believes the best is yet to come, but complaint focuses on what is wrong with the present and glorifies an unreal past. Can you get there in your brain with me? Have you ever had those conversations where you're trying to reflect upon the way things used to be and you remember a certain aspect of them and then you're grateful for the way things are now in certain aspects? I hear the Israelites in my own echoes of enough is enough. As I shake my head at the constant barrage of the overwhelming headlines, burdens, the frustrations that cause me to long for, wish for the good old days. Maybe saying something like, wish we could turn back time to the good old days when our mama sang us to sleep. But now, stressed out. I've alluded to this before, but if God was needing a reason to change his mind about never again destroying all of humanity with a flood, wouldn't right about now, in the history of mankind, Exodus chapter 16, his chosen people complaining after he freed them from enslaved labor in Egypt, how about right now, as a reason for God to go, you know that old promise that I made about not destroying this whole world again with a flood? Remember that rainbow that you see from time to time? How about forget that and bring on the water? If God was needing a reason, he had it here, these grumbling Israelites. But instead of destroying these people, instead of destroying these grumblers, look what God does in the next verses. Verse 4. Then the Lord said to Moses, Look, Moses, I'm going to rain down food from heaven for you. Each day the people can go out and pick up as much food as they need for that day. I will test them in this and see whether or not they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day, they'll gather food, and when they prepare it, there will be twice as much as usual. The Israelites, you see what's going on here? The Israelites are calling out, we're starving, we don't like this, we're hungry. We miss the good old days. The good old days of being slaves in a foreign land where at least we didn't have to worry about this food provision. And God says, watch this. Again, for me, as I read this passage of Scripture, again, I must acknowledge the differences between God's grace and my grace. My grace would have run out in the grumbling. My grace would have looked a lot like, all right, I'm turning this van around. But God, in his perfect grace, chooses a much different follow-up answer than I would have. Me as God in this scenario? Enough is enough. I'm tired of this complaining. Strike up the lightning. Bring on the thunder. Let's do some fire and brimstone. Let's destroy just the guys with mustaches. Something to get their attention again, right? Something to shake them up. God as God here says, my enough is enough. And I love you. And as I stand before you again this day, I'm comforted, as I hope you are too, that the God of the universe sees us, knows us, sees our need, knows our need before we even do, and he desires to provide for our needs. His grace is far bigger, deeper, wider than my grace. His resources far supersede my own. Even when I doubt it, God's enough is enough. Even when I think something's wrong with his timing, God's enough is enough. Even when I think he's taking too long, even when I've told him exactly how to fix the problem, even when I've exhausted every other human resource to try to patch the hole and fix the brokenness, even when I've told him 1,000 times what he should do if he wants to receive all the glory, his grace is better. His plan is better. His enough is enough. Look what happens next, verse 11. So the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the Israelites' complaints. I've heard them. These same people who complained about being enslaved. I've heard their complaint. Now tell them, in the evening you will have meat to eat, and in the morning you will have all the bread you want. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. Verse 13, that evening, vast numbers of quail flew in and covered the camp. The next morning, the area around the camp was wet with dew, and when the dew evaporated, a flaky substance as fine as frost blanketed the ground. The Israelites were puzzled when they saw it. What is it? They asked each other. They had no idea what it was. And Moses told them, you dummies. That's not in Scripture. As Moses told them, it's the food the Lord has given you to eat. And these are the Lord's instructions. Each household should gather as much as it needs. Pick up 2 quarts for each person in your tent. Can you see this again? God offering his miraculous, undeserved provisions for a grumbling people. Saying to them in the evening, you're going to have meat, and in the morning, you're going to have all the bread that you want. These elements of quail and manna. Manna, the Hebrew word for, what is it? A direct derivative of this word that we use to mean, what is it? They had no idea. Again, it's the grace of the Lord that is so evident here. As he hears the Israelites' complaints, he tells Moses, I've heard them, and I'm choosing to provide exactly what they need. And then, in verse 16, as we just read, some guardrails, some directions in his provision, some guidelines for them to experience it in the fullness of what his offer is. Enough being enough. There will be enough, God said. Each household should gather just as much as is needed, 2 quarts for each person in your tent. Now we read that verse and we go, that's good. God gave good advice, good direction to these Israelites. And I wonder, as I cross my arms and shake my head at the Israelites because of what they are about to do, I wonder which group I would have been in. As they're told by Moses in this moment that God is going to provide for them, that God is going to have enough for them, that his enough is enough, that they should each gather just enough, it reminds me of what I might have chosen to do with my group of friends and family in these instructions. Because I've experienced them. I've experienced very similar situations in a humorous way. When our kids were little and we were pastoring in Shippensburg, we went to other community churches' Easter egg hunts. And I was one of those parents who wanted my kids to have more eggs than the other kids. And my kids weren't the fastest kids, they are now. But I knew how to make sure that my kids had more than enough. I'll just help knock some other kid down so that your kid, my kid, can get more eggs. Do you know any of those parents? Have you ever been one of those parents? Do you have that similar tendency that when there are guidelines laid about, when someone says from a megaphone, hey, only 8 eggs per kid, you're thinking, did they say 80? Do you know our human tendency? Do you sense inside? Let's try a different scenario. Movie theater candy, way too expensive. I mean, it's like 10 times what it costs at the dollar store, right? We got pockets. Hello? What was us? How about when the sign at the store says limit 1 per customer? That's why we have kids, right? That's why we teach our kids to go through the line in front of us or behind us, so that we can have more than enough. Maybe this one works. Speed limit says 70. That's just for soccer moms, right? I'm a trained professional, for goodness. I've been playing video games my whole life. I can drive safer than everybody else. Our human nature often involves us looking to better
ourselves. This reminder here in Exodus forces me to acknowledge just how often we need God's gentle reminders of His enough being enough. In all the ways that I think I know better than God, in all the ways that my mind says my plan is better. Jesus teaching His disciples to pray the prayer. We call it the Lord's Prayer as He teaches the disciples to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." These are wonderful words for us to recite, but a whole nother level for us to understand and live out this practice of trusting God with our daily needs, one day at a time. Versus my temptation to hoard my resources, versus the temptation to battle daily with worry about, will I have enough for tomorrow? Do you see this mirror in the life of the Israelites here? I need this. We need this. Reminder often to embrace God's daily provision. His enough is enough. The storyline continues. Verse 17, so the people of Israel did as they were told. Some gathered a lot, some only a little. But when they all measured it out, everyone had just enough. God's provision was theirs. Those who gathered a lot had nothing left over. Those who gathered only a little had enough. Each family had just what it needed. Do you hear the testimony here? God's provision, God's plan of there being enough to go around. The testimony is true. God's enough was enough. From the fleshy quail to the flaky manna. God's provision, God's hand of blessing, God's grace, unmerited, undeserved, was enough. His enough was enough. But the story doesn't end. Verse 19, Moses told them, Hey, Israel, do not keep any of it until morning. Verse 20. But some of them didn't listen. Some of them didn't listen and kept some of it until morning. But by then it was full of maggots, had a terrible smell. Moses was very angry with them. This is where we continue to shake our heads at Israel, right? This is where we continue to look at these people and we're reading the storyline and we continue on and this happens again and again. Israel does stupid stuff again and again. Somebody say, that's us. We shake our heads. We get annoyed. Maybe like Moses, we get angry. Maybe Moses in this moment is saying, Israel, God's enough is enough. He's going to provide. He's got this. He's in control. Look, taste, see, know that He is good. He will supply every need. Verse 20. But some of them didn't listen and kept some until the next morning. What Israel is saying here in their actions is God's enough isn't enough. Every time we take back control of God's guidelines, God's desire for us to experience life and to the full, we're saying the same thing. Enough isn't enough. Moses' response, Exodus 16, verse 20, Moses gets angry. Moses is saying, as we have said in our exasperation, enough is enough. You people. He'll have to get to this point again and again during these years of wandering. And all the while, the voice in the background, that still small voice of God, as He's watching this play out, He continues to call to His people, my enough is enough. Will you wait? Will you listen? Will you receive? Our response
to the truth of God's enough being enough is that we need to learn to cultivate an attitude of gratitude. Have you heard that before? To express thanksgiving often, first, repeatedly, to make it a part of our spiritual discipline, this exercise of expressing our gratefulness, our gratitude, our thanksgiving. It's an exercise that trains us to trust again and again and again in God's provision, to become muscle memory for us to express our thanksgiving to God for what He has given us, for how overwhelmingly blessed we are as we express that thanksgiving. What we are doing in those moments is we are learning to trust again in God's provision. As we tell others, as we testify to His blessing and His provision, we are training ourselves, being remade to be a people who trust, appreciating His daily provisions. This is the key to overcoming that human sinful DNA that says, enough is not enough. People of God, we are blessed. Take a breath again. Bounce up and down your squishy chair. Scout's got it. Feel the 90 degrees in this building right now. Think about what you're going to eat this afternoon. Think about the options that are before you. Do you know how blessed we are? Overwhelmingly blessed. Overwhelmingly blessed. As we prepare our hearts to participate at the Lord's table in just a few minutes, will you allow the words of this song to remind you again in your heart of hearts how you're blessed, how we're blessed? Watch this.